He made millions playing America's most notorious bigot. Yet, off camera, he was a highly educated progressive who deeply despised the prejudice he performed. This is the tragic reality of Archie Bunker, how All in the Family destroyed Carroll O'Connor. The flawless performance gave him absolute industry power, but it permanently erased his true identity, leaving him typecast for life and trapped in that famous armchair. But the cruelest paradox happened far from the soundstage. How did an actor who ruthlessly controlled the biggest television empire in America find himself utterly powerless to stop his own son from pulling the trigger? The ring of a telephone rarely sounds like the end of the world. But on March 28, 1995, inside a quiet residence in Pacific Palisades, California, a sharp chime fractured a family permanently. 70-year-old Carroll O'Connor picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was frantic, slurred, and terrifyingly familiar. It was his 32-year-old son, Hugh. "Dad," Hugh said, his voice stripped of hope. "I can't beat it anymore. I'm going to kill myself." The words struck with physical force. Carroll was a man accustomed to authority. He commanded television sets, dictated the pacing of scenes, and dominated network executives in closed-door negotiations. Now, holding the receiver, he was completely stripped of power. He pleaded with his son, his voice dropping to the desperate register of a parent watching their child slip off a ledge. He told Hugh to wait, to hold on, promising that help was coming. Carroll immediately alerted the police. Squad cars rushed toward Hugh's home, but the distance between a father's desperate love and a son's terminal exhaustion was too vast to close. Police officers arrived at the property just in time to hear the definitive, deafening crack of a gunshot echoing from inside. Hugh O'Connor was dead at 32. For Carroll, the silence that followed the confirmation of his son's death was absolute. Sitting alone in the heavy quiet of his home, his immense wealth and historical television legacy meant nothing. The helplessness was total. Sitting alone in the heavy quiet of his home, the brutal paradox of his life was absolute. He possessed total control over America's most famous fictional family, while his real one was violently torn apart. Yet before the absolute silence of that Pacific Palisades home, Carroll O'Connor was the undisputed titan of American television. But long before he became the face of working-class American conservatism, he was a man of a vastly different world. Born in Queens, New York, in 1924, he was raised in a fiercely intellectual environment. He did not possess the unpolished, grating edge of the character that would later define him. Instead, he pursued higher education with a voracious appetite, studying at the University of Montana before moving across the Atlantic to earn his degree from University College Dublin. He was a staunch progressive. Living a bohemian life in Europe, he absorbed diverse cultures and developed a deep-seated hatred for racial prejudice and social inequality. He began his career as a theatrical actor, taking on small stage roles and minor film parts. He was a thinker, a liberal artist who viewed the world through a lens of empathy and inclusion, the exact opposite of the bigot he would one day make famous. He spent his evenings debating political theory and reading classic literature, cultivating a refined intellect that defined his core identity. To him, acting was a noble pursuit meant to elevate the human condition, not a mechanism for mass-produced mockery. He deliberately distanced himself from the ugly, uneducated prejudices that festered in the underbelly of American society. The thought of embodying such ignorance repulsed him on a fundamental, visceral level. For O'Connor, the stage was a sacred space meant to challenge the audience's moral complacency, not a mirror to validate their darkest, most regressive impulses. He spent hours in Roman cafes fiercely deconstructing the civil rights struggles happening back home, aligning himself entirely with the marginalized voices demanding justice across the Atlantic. He viewed the virulent racism of the American working class not as a comedic quirk, but as a societal disease that required systemic eradication. To him, lending his physical form to such a toxic caricature felt akin to drinking poison, a profound betrayal of the empathetic philosophy that governed his every waking thought. In 1968, O'Connor was living comfortably in Italy, carving out a modest living as a working actor. It was there that television producer Norman Lear tracked him down with a script for a new American pilot, based on a British show called Till Death Us Do Part. The lead role was Archie Bunker, a loud-mouthed, narrow-minded, deeply offensive patriarch. O'Connor read the script and immediately balked. He firmly believed the character was far too abrasive for the sanitized, carefully controlled landscape of American television. He feared that playing such an intensely unlikable figure would alienate audiences and permanently damage his quiet, building career. He initially turned Lear down, but the reality of a working actor's life ultimately dictated his decision. The production offered a free trip back to New York and a solid, guaranteed paycheck. Viewing the pilot as a quick job and a stepping stone to more serious theatrical work, O'Connor finally signed the contract. He packed his bags for America, fully convinced that the show would generate controversy and be swiftly canceled by nervous network executives. He stepped onto the set, expecting a short-lived gig. He had no idea that Archie Bunker was not just a temporary role, but a permanent new identity waiting to consume him. When the first episode of All in the Family broadcast on January 12, 1971, network executives were so terrified of the public reaction that they attached a formal disclaimer to the opening, warning viewers of the show's abrasive content. American television had spent 2 decades meticulously constructing an illusion of domestic perfection. Sitcom fathers were wise, gentle, and universally respected. Carroll O'Connor shattered that illusion in less than 30 minutes. He delivered a character who was unapologetically crude, defensive, and openly hostile to the evolving world around him. But the true genius of the performance and the catalyst for the show's unprecedented explosion in popularity was not simply the shocking dialogue. It was the meticulous, calculated craft O'Connor employed to build the man in the armchair. O'Connor understood that if Archie Bunker was played merely as a one-dimensional villain, the audience would reject him immediately. To make the satire work, he had to engineer a complex psychological profile. He did not just memorize Lear's scripts. He physically transformed his urbane European-educated frame into a tense blue-collar worker constantly bracing for an attack. He slouched his shoulders, tightened his jaw, and utilized a defensive clipped cadence. More importantly, he weaponized language. O'Connor perfected the use of malapropisms, the unintentional misuse of similar-sounding words, to expose Archie's deep-seated ignorance while simultaneously rendering him harmlessly absurd. When Archie complained about a groin ecologist or referenced the consecration camp, it was a deliberate acting choice by O'Connor to strip the character of any real intellectual authority. He played Archie not as a monster, but as a frightened, obsolete man, desperately clinging to a social order that was evaporating before his eyes. This required a grueling emotional compartmentalization that slowly began to fracture his own psyche. Every time the cameras rolled, O'Connor had to forcefully suppress his own progressive intellect and inject himself with a toxic worldview he actively despised. He was essentially performing a daily psychological self-mutilation for the entertainment of the masses. The sustained effort of maintaining this abrasive facade left him exhausted, drained, and deeply conflicted long after the studio lights went dark. He frequently returned to his dressing room with a pounding migraine, his muscles physically aching from the unnatural defensive rigidity he forced upon his body to portray Archie's perpetual outrage. The psychological whiplash of snapping between his own soft-spoken, progressive reality and the character's booming, hateful rhetoric required a mental compartmentalization that slowly eroded his baseline peace of mind. He found himself inexplicably irritable at home, haunted by the creeping fear that the toxic bile he spewed on stage was somehow staining his own soul. It was a terrifying realization that the mask he wore so perfectly was beginning to fuse with his actual skin, demanding a heavier toll than any paycheck could ever justify. This calculated vulnerability is exactly what caused the show to detonate in the cultural consciousness. By the end of its first season, All in the Family was the undisputed centerpiece of American media. It dominated the #1 spot in the Nielsen ratings for 5 consecutive years. O'Connor's masterful execution earned him 4 Emmy Awards. He was suddenly commanding a massive salary. His face was on the cover of magazines, and he was universally recognized as the most vital comedic actor of his generation. The financial anxiety of his early career vanished overnight. He possessed absolute industry leverage and a platform that reached over 50 million viewers every week. Yet beneath the avalanche of accolades and unprecedented wealth, a deeply disturbing reality was beginning to take root in O'Connor's daily life. The satire was misfiring in the most dangerous way possible. The liberal writers and the liberal actor had designed Archie Bunker to be a mirror reflecting the ugliness of American prejudice. Ending for the audience to laugh at the absurdity of bigotry. Instead, a massive portion of the American public embraced Archie not as a cautionary tale, but as a champion. They did not see the joke. They saw themselves. O'Connor began to experience profoundly unsettling encounters in public. Fans would approach him on the streets of New York and Los Angeles, offering conspiratorial winks, shaking his hand, and whispering racist or anti-Semitic remarks, fully assuming that the actor shared the character's toxic worldview. He found himself staring into the faces of people who represented everything he had fought against, realizing they viewed him as their loudest advocate. The nausea was immediate and profound. He could not publicly scream at his own fan base without destroying the network's most valuable asset, forcing him to swallow his disgust. Every handshake felt like a betrayal of his own moral compass, chaining him further to a demographic he wanted to educate, not embolden. For a man who had spent his life championing civil rights and progressive causes, these interactions were psychologically agonizing. He was being celebrated by the very demographic he despised. The adulation of the masses became a heavy, suffocating weight. Every Emmy he won, every rating record the show broke, only cemented the public's absolute conflation of Carroll O'Connor and Archie Bunker. He had achieved the ultimate pinnacle of his profession, reaching a level of fame most actors could barely comprehend. But looking in the mirror, O'Connor increasingly felt that he was being erased. The world did not love him. They loved the loud, bigoted phantom he put on like a heavy coat every morning. The wealth and the awards were undeniable, but the actor was slowly realizing that his greatest professional triumph was rapidly becoming a psychological trap from which he might never escape. By the summer of 1974, the dynamic behind the scenes of America's most popular television program had transferred from a collaborative creative environment into a hostile corporate battleground. Carroll O'Connor was no longer just a working actor, grateful for a weekly paycheck. He was the indispensable engine driving a broadcasting empire that generated unprecedented advertising revenue for the CBS network. He knew exactly how much money the network and the producers were making from his physical and emotional labor. More importantly, he knew that the show simply could not exist without him. This acute awareness of his own value, colliding with his growing resentment toward the material he was forced to perform, ignited one of the most vicious power struggles in television history. The conflict was fundamentally about power and intellectual respect. O'Connor, the highly educated, meticulously trained stage actor, found himself increasingly at war with creator Norman Lear and the show's team of writers. O'Connor did not view Archie Bunker as a simple caricature to be manipulated for cheap laughs. He had engineered the character's psychology from the ground up. He felt a fierce, almost obsessive ownership over Archie's voice. During table reads and rehearsals, O'Connor frequently halted production to challenge the scripts. He argued that the writers, in their pursuit of political satire, were making Archie too cartoonish, too blatantly villainous, or logically inconsistent. O'Connor demanded that Archie remain rooted in a recognizable, albeit flawed, human reality. These creative disputes rapidly escalated from minor disagreements into fundamental clashes over authority. O'Connor decided to draw a hard line. He issued an ultimatum to Lear and the network executives. He wanted a massive salary increase to reflect his status as the undisputed star of the network. But more crucially, he demanded absolute script approval. In the landscape of 1970s television, granting a sitcom actor final sign-off on narrative direction was virtually unheard of. O'Connor understood the brutal mathematics of the industry perfectly. He generated the ratings, which generated the advertising revenue, which paid everyone's salaries. Recognizing that studio executives viewed him as merely a highly paid cog in their syndication machine, he refused to be marginalized by men who had never endured the psychological burden of breathing life into the network's most lucrative monster. He decided to test the limits of his structural power, negotiating not as an employee but dictating terms as an unyielding corporate entity. He possessed the rare, dangerous combination of absolute artistic conviction and the sheer financial ruthlessness required to call their bluff. By demanding a seat at the writer's table and ultimate script approval, he was violently reclaiming his intellectual sovereignty from a system that demanded his total submission. It was a direct challenge to Norman Lear's absolute rule. Lear flatly refused. In response, O'Connor weaponized his only real point of leverage, his physical presence. As production for the highly anticipated fifth season was set to begin in July 1974, O'Connor simply did not show up. He abandoned the CBS Television City soundstage. He retreated to his home and initiated a complete strike, effectively holding the highest-rated show in America hostage. The network was thrown into immediate panic. Millions of dollars in pre-sold advertising hung in the balance. O'Connor then escalated the conflict legally, filing a lawsuit against Lear's production company demanding $64,000 in withheld back pay and a radical restructuring of his contract. Norman Lear, a formidable power broker in his own right, refused to be intimidated. He countered O'Connor's strike with a brutal and calculated display of executive force. Lear immediately deployed a team of lawyers to file an injunction against O'Connor. A judge ruled in Lear's favor, issuing a legally binding order that explicitly forbade O'Connor from accepting any other acting work, appearing on any their network, or performing in any capacity while the dispute was active. Lear had effectively trapped O'Connor. The actor was locked out of his own show and legally barred from earning a living anywhere else in the entertainment industry. To further demonstrate his ruthlessness, Lear took the extraordinary step of writing O'Connor out of the show entirely. Lear commissioned his writing staff to rapidly produce 3 new episodes where Archie Bunker simply disappeared. The storyline centered on the family desperately searching for their missing patriarch, leaving the audience and O'Connor to wonder if the character would ever return. Lear openly floated the idea to the press that if O'Connor did not submit, Archie Bunker would be permanently killed off, and the show would continue without him. It was a high-stakes game of psychological warfare, played out in the national headlines. The standoff lasted for weeks, characterized by intense closed-door legal negotiations and bitter public posturing. Ultimately, the financial realities of the television industry forced a resolution. The network could not afford to lose its crown jewel, and Lear knew that the audience would not tolerate a show without its central antagonist for long. A settlement was hammered out. O'Connor agreed to return to the set. In exchange, he secured a monumental victory. He received a massive salary increase that made him one of the highest paid performers in the world. Crucially, he also secured a percentage of the show's syndication profits. O'Connor possessed the foresight to understand that the real wealth in television lay in reruns. This single contractual victory guaranteed him and his family generational wealth. He also forced significant concessions regarding his input on the scripts, cementing his creative authority over the character. Carroll O'Connor had taken on the most powerful producers in Hollywood and won. He broke the standard industry power dynamic and seized control of his own financial destiny. But walking back onto the soundstage for the remainder of the season, the atmosphere was irrevocably poisoned. The victory was overwhelmingly bitter. The camaraderie and shared artistic purpose that had defined the early years of the production were entirely gone. O'Connor was no longer viewed as a collaborative partner by the crew and the writing staff. He was viewed as an adversary, a boss, and a threat. The protracted legal war had hardened him. He became notoriously difficult, deeply suspicious of network interference, and fiercely isolated. He barricaded himself inside his dressing room, intensely scrutinizing every line of dialogue delivered to him. The physical toll of this constant vigilance was staggering. He treated every script revision as a potential ambush, parsing words with a brutal, cynical eye to ensure his hard-won authority was not being undermined. The joy of performance was entirely replaced by the cold, mechanical execution of a legally binding contract. He had built an impenetrable wall around himself, ensuring his dominance, but guaranteeing his absolute crushing solitude. The backstage environment devolved into a sterile, transactional arena where spontaneous creativity was smothered by intense paranoia and legal technicalities. O'Connor sat alone in the shadows between takes, fiercely guarding the parameters of his character like a warden patrolling the perimeter of a high-security prison. He alienated the very colleagues who had helped build his legacy. trading the warm, collaborative spirit of a television ensemble for the icy, absolute power of an autocrat. This self-imposed exile insulated him from network interference, but it also cut him off from the human connection that had initially drawn him to the theater, leaving him as a dictator ruling over an increasingly joyless kingdom. He had successfully fought to protect his artistic integrity and secure his financial empire. But in winning the legal war, O'Connor sacrificed his joy for the craft. The set was no longer a stage. It was a fortress he had to defend daily. He had conquered Norman Lear and bent the CBS network to his will. Yet, as the years dragged on, O'Connor slowly realized the terrifying irony of his triumph. He had fought with every ounce of his strength to gain absolute control over Archie Bunker, only to discover that the character was slowly taking absolute control over him. In the spring of 1979, the final episode of All in the Family was broadcast to an audience of tens of millions, marking the definitive end of a television era. Carroll O'Connor was 55 years old. He had completely conquered the medium. He had delivered a performance so culturally defining, so deeply embedded in the American consciousness, that the worn armchair his character occupied was immediately requested by the Smithsonian Institution for its permanent collection. After 9 grueling years of intense production schedules, constant public scrutiny, and bitter backstage battles over creative control, O'Connor finally took off Archie Bunker's trademark fedora. He genuinely expected to walk away as a free man. He anticipated a flood of new scripts, lucrative offers for prestigious dramatic films, and a triumphant return to the serious, theatrical roots that had defined his early life. He was a highly decorated, internationally recognized star, possessing immense financial backing and unquestionable acting ability. The next chapter of his career should have been limitless. Instead, a chilling, absolute silence fell over his professional life. The phone simply stopped ringing. Hollywood is an industry built on visual associations, and casting directors across the studio system shared the same insurmountable problem. They could no longer look at Carroll O'Connor and see an actor. They only saw a walking, breathing trademark. The sheer magnitude of his television success had rendered him radioactive to film directors. If a studio cast O'Connor as a sympathetic grandfather, a cunning corporate lawyer, or a tragic protagonist, the audience would spend the entire film waiting for him to deliver a bigoted punchline. The character had been etched so deeply into the American psyche that it completely erased the man playing him. He was not just typecast, he was permanently branded. His agent's phone lines remained agonizingly silent, offering a brutal confirmation that the industry had collectively decided his artistic utility was permanently exhausted. He spent his days pacing the immaculate halls of his sprawling estate, paralyzed by the realization that his unparalleled comedic triumph had effectively functioned as a career-ending suicide mission. The scripts he desperately wanted to read, nuanced, dramatic, morally complex narratives, were being routed to lesser actors who lacked his talent but possessed the distinct advantage of a clean slate. He was trapped in a bizarre cultural purgatory, a living monument to a bygone television era, forced to watch his immense dramatic potential slowly wither on the vine. Faced with a sudden, devastating lack of viable career alternatives, O'Connor found himself backed into a terrifying professional corner. He had an expensive production company to maintain, a dedicated staff that relied on him for their livelihoods, and a hard-won status within the CBS network hierarchy that he absolutely refused to surrender. stripped of better options, and facing the prospect of total industry irrelevance, he made a deeply reluctant, soul-crushing concession. He agreed to reprise the role in a spin-off series, Archie Bunker's Place. For another 4 years, from 1979 to 1983, O'Connor strapped himself back into the psychological straitjacket he had so desperately wanted to shed. He dragged the character into a new decade, grinding out episodes to maintain his income and his grip on network power. The scripts lacked the biting revolutionary edge of the early years, reducing his groundbreak king creation to a tired, predictable caricature. He walked through the blocking and delivered the punchlines with a grim, practiced efficiency, viewing the soundstage as an assembly line rather than a creative space. The massive paychecks continued to clear, but they felt increasingly like hush money paid to silence his artistic ambitions. He was actively financing his own irrelevance, but the creative fire was entirely extinguished. He was no longer an artist exploring a complex, groundbreaking satire. He was a hostage, mechanically maintaining a corporate asset. Putting the costume back on every morning felt less like acting and more like serving a life sentence. When Archie Bunker's Place finally ended its run, the reality of his permanent captivity settled in with brutal finality. O'Connor spent the mid-1980s navigating a wasteland of professional irrelevance. The man who had revolutionized the American sitcom was functionally blacklisted by the sheer gravity of his own success. He was a king without a kingdom, a masterful actor denied a stage because his previous performance was simply too loud to talk over. It was not until 1988 that he finally managed to pry his way out of the comedy genre, securing the lead role in the dramatic television adaptation of In the Heat of the Night. O'Connor took the role of Police Chief Bill Gillespie, a tough, pragmatic Southern lawman navigating the extreme racial tensions of a small Mississippi town. He approached the role with a fierce, almost desperate determination to prove his dramatic range and obliterate the ghost of his past. He completely overhauled his physical demeanor, shedding the defensive, hunched posture of the Queen's dock worker for the quiet, imposing, still authority of a veteran police officer. He weaponized silence, using long, unblinking stares to project power, rather than relying on the frantic, loud outbursts that had defined his previous decade. Every gesture was tightly controlled, a deliberate assassination of the comedic rhythms that casting directors assumed he could not break. He refused to allow even a trace of a New York accent to slip into his deep, resonant Southern drawl. He was rebuilding his professional identity brick by brick, refusing to be buried alive by a sitcom. He exerted heavy, relentless influence over the show's writing, demanding that Gillespie evolve into a progressive, fair-minded leader who actively dismantled the racial prejudices of his environment. It was a deliberate, calculated inversion of everything he had represented in the 1970s. It was an artistic exorcism. Professionally, the pivot was a massive, undeniable triumph. In the Heat of the Night became a colossal ratings hit, anchoring the network's lineup. In 1989, O'Connor's meticulous, grounded performance earned him his 5th Emmy Award, this time for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series. He had successfully built a second massive television franchise in a completely different genre. He had proven to the industry elite that his talent extended far beyond a single comedic persona. But public perception is a formidable, unyielding force that does not care about industry awards. While television critics praised Chief Gillespie, the average American viewer simply could not and would not separate the actor from his defining legacy. When O'Connor walked down the street, people did not call him Chief. They still shouted for Archie. Letters poured into the studio from fans who referred to his new character simply as Archie Bunker in a police uniform. No matter how many dramatic awards he won, no matter how many progressive storylines he championed on his new show, the public stubbornly refused to let the old character die. The phantom of the armchair followed him onto every new set, into every interview, and down every public street. O'Connor was forced to confront a cold, unalterable truth about the mechanics of fame. He had built a cultural monument so massive that it permanently agged out his own son. Reflecting on the trajectory of his career during this period, O'Connor summarized his reality with sharp, unflinching clarity. Archie Bunker has been both the best and the worst thing that ever happened to me. I can never escape him. Fame had provided him with a life of extraordinary financial privilege, but it had entirely confiscated his true identity. He lived in a beautifully designed prison of his own making, a captive to the very audience that adored him. He was a man shackled to a phantom, entirely stripped of the freedom to be himself. By the time O'Connor secured his dramatic triumph in the heat of the night, his private world was collapsing. The foundation of this crisis began decades earlier. In 1962, while filming in Rome, O'Connor had adopted a son, Hugh. He built a fortress of privilege around the boy, intent on shielding him from the harsh realities of the world. For the first 16 years of Hugh's life, the fortress held. But in 1978, at the height of O'Connor's massive television fame, an enemy breached the walls that no amount of CBS network money could repel. 16-year-old Hugh was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a severe and terrifying form of lymphatic cancer. The diagnosis brought the most powerful actor in television to his knees. O'Connor immediately leveraged his immense wealth to secure the most advanced oncological care available. He stood helplessly in sterile hospital rooms, watching his teenage son endure the brutal, agonizing onslaught of 1970s chemotherapy and radiation treatments. The physical toll was devastating. Hugh withered under the chemical assault, fighting a daily excruciating battle simply to survive. For O'Connor, it was a masterclass in absolute powerlessness. He could dictate the terms of multi-million-dollar contracts, but he could not order the mutated cells out of his son's body. He stared at his vast accumulated wealth and realized its terrifying limitations. Millions of dollars in sin, dication money could not buy a single healthy white blood cell. The ruthless negotiation tactics that had shattered Norman Lear were completely useless against the silent arithmetic of pediatric oncology. He was stripped down to the raw, agonizing core of a parent watching their child slowly fade. The empire he had built suddenly felt entirely meaningless compared to the steady drip of an IV bag. Miraculously, Hugh fought back. He survived the cancer. The disease went into remission, and the O'Connor family celebrated what felt like a definitive hard-won victory. But the medical establishment of the era had unknowingly handed the boy a loaded weapon. To manage the intense, agonizing pain of the chemotherapy and surgeries, doctors had prescribed Hugh heavy, highly addictive painkillers. The narcotics had done their job. They masked the physical agony of the cancer. But for a traumatized 16-year-old boy, the drugs offered something far more insidious. They masked the psychological terror of facing death. Long after the cancer cells were eradicated, the chemical dependency remained. Hugh had beaten the lymphoma, but the cure had quietly opened the door to a lifelong devastating addiction to drugs. Throughout the 1980s, as O'Connor fought his own professional battles, to escape the shadow of Archie Bunker, a much darker war was raging inside his home. Hugh's dependence on prescription painkillers steadily escalated into a severe, uncontrollable addiction to harder narcotics. O'Connor deployed every resource at his disposal. He funded countless stints in elite, expensive rehabilitation clinics. He hired private investigators to track down the dealers supplying his son. He staged interventions, oscillating between furious demands for sobriety and desperate, weeping pleas. He liquidated vast sums of his syndication wealth to erect an invisible blockade around his son, futilely attempting to purchase a cure for a disease that defied both logic and money. The premonition of tragedy grew into a deafening roar in O'Connor's mind. He had built an empire, he had defeated network presidents, and he had changed American culture. But staring into the empty, exhausted eyes of his son, Carroll O'Connor finally realized he was losing the only war that actually mattered. By the time O'Connor secured the lead role in the dramatic series In the Heat of the Night in 1988, he was a man living a terrifying double life. By day, he was Chief Bill Gillespie, an authoritative lawman who commanded respect and imposed order on a chaotic world. By night, he was a terrified father, waiting by the telephone, dreading the call that would tell him his son's heart had finally stopped. In a calculated, desperate bid to save his son's life, O'Connor used his immense leverage as the show's star and executive producer to pull Hugh directly into his professional orbit. He demanded the network cast Hugh in a recurring role as Officer Lonnie Jameson. This was not a simple act of Hollywood nepotism. It was a father throwing a lifeline to a drowning man. O'Connor believed that if he could keep Hugh beside him on the set in Georgia, if he could impose the strict, unforgiving structure of a television production schedule onto his son's chaotic life, he could keep the boy sober. He wanted to give Hugh a purpose, an identity, and a reason to wake up in the morning that did not involve a needle or a pill. For a time, the strategy appeared to work. The set of In the Heat of the Night became a sanctuary. When the cameras rolled, the crushing weight of their reality vanished. For those brief moments between action and cut, they were not a terrified father and an addicted son. They were just a police chief and a young officer. The scenes they shared on screen possessed a quiet, fragile beauty. The television audience saw a gruff boss mentoring a rookie, but the crew standing behind the camera saw something profoundly different. They saw Carroll O'Connor watching his son hit his Emmy arcs, deliver his lines, and stand tall. In those fleeting moments, Hugh was sharp, focused, and entirely sober. For O'Connor, the joy of working opposite his son was immense, but it was incredibly fragile. It was a manufactured reality, a tightly controlled environment where the script dictated a safe outcome. But the brutal reality of addiction does not respect television schedules. The structure of the soundstage could not cure the physiological rewiring of Hugh's brain. When the production wrapped for the day and the lights went down, the demons waiting in the shadows immediately returned. Despite the career success, despite the constant supervision, and despite the overwhelming, suffocating love of his father, Hugh's relapses became more frequent and more severe. The drugs tightened their grip, systematically stripping away the young man's will to live. O'Connor watched the vibrant, talented actor he worked with during the day transform back into a hollow, desperate addict by night. The premonition of tragedy grew into a deafening roar in O'Connor's mind. He had built an empire. He had defeated network presidents, and he had changed American culture. But staring into the empty, exhausted eyes of his son, Carroll O'Connor finally realized he was losing the only war that actually mattered. The calendar marked March 28, 1995, as a day of celebration. It was Hugh O'Connor's third wedding anniversary. He had a wife, Angela, and a 2-year-old son named Sean. From the outside, the framework of a stable, fulfilling life was entirely in place. He had a family, a steady acting role secured by his father on a hit television series, and the boundless financial safety net of the O'Connor estate. But the brutal mechanics of chemical dependency do not care about anniversaries, family ties, or bank accounts. Inside Hugh's mind, the war had already been lost. The cocaine and prescription pills had systematically dismantled his rationality, replacing his will to live with a crushy, inescapable exhaustion. When the telephone rang in Carroll O'Connor's Pacific Palisades home that afternoon, the actor did not know he was about to face the defining trauma of his existence. He picked up the receiver and heard his son's voice. It was slurred, hollow, and utterly devoid of hope. Hugh did not call to ask for another stint in rehab. He did not call to ask for money. He called to deliver a final verdict. He told his father he could not beat the addiction. He stated with chilling clarity that he was going to shoot himself. In that fractured moment, the immense power Carroll O'Connor wielded in the entertainment industry evaporated. He was no longer a television icon or a millionaire producer. He was simply an elderly, terrified father standing in his living room, staring into an abyss. He adopted a tone of desperate negotiation. He pleaded, he commanded, and he begged. He told Hugh to stay on the line. He promised that he was sending help immediately. While keeping his son engaged, O'Connor managed to contact the police, dispatching them to Hugh's residence. For a few agonizing minutes, O'Connor held the line, listening to the erratic breathing of his son across the city, praying that the sirens would reach the house before the darkness consumed the boy. But the intervention arrived too late. The police breached the property just as Hugh pulled the trigger of a gun he had recently purchased. The sudden violent end to a 32-year life echoed through the telephone receiver. When the authorities confirmed the suicide, Carroll O'Connor physically and emotionally collapsed. The fortress he had built to protect his son since adopting him in Rome had failed completely. The initial shock gave way to a paralyzing, suffocating grief. For most public figures, a tragedy of this magnitude prompts an immediate retreat behind a wall of public relations managers and carefully crafted statements. Families of addicts often hide the cause of death out of a misplaced sense of shame. But Carroll O'Connor did not retreat. As the hours passed, his paralyzing sorrow mutated into a blinding, weaponized fury. He refused to let his son die in the shadows. Just days after the suicide, while still navigating the absolute wreckage of his personal life, O'Connor stepped outside his home to face a swarm of reporters and news cameras. He looked directly into the lenses, his face deeply lined with exhaustion and rage. He discarded the Hollywood playbook entirely. He did not ask for privacy. Instead, he used his massive cultural megaphone to launch a direct, targeted attack. He publicly named Harry Thomas Perzigian, a Los Angeles resident, as the man who had been continuously supplying Hugh with cocaine. O'Connor did not mince words. He branded Perzigian a partner in murder and stated unequivocally that this man was directly responsible for putting the gun in his son's hand. It was an unprecedented television moment, A beloved American patriarch was leveraging his fame to declare a personal war against a specific named drug dealer on national news. The public accusation triggered immediate legal consequences. Law enforcement, operating on the intense public scrutiny generated by O'Connor's statements, raided Perzigian's apartment, found cocaine, and arrested him for drug possession. Perzigian was eventually convicted of the possession charges, but the story did not end with a simple criminal conviction. In a maneuver of staggering audacity, Harry Thomas Perzigian decided to strike back at the grieving father. He filed a civil lawsuit against Carroll O'Connor, suing the actor for defamation of character and slander. Perzigian claimed that O'Connor's highly publicized accusation of murder had ruined his reputation and caused him severe emotional distress. For Carroll O'Connor, the lawsuit was a grotesque insult. He was being dragged into a courtroom by the very man who had profited from his son's fatal addiction. But O'Connor welcomed the fight. He refused to settle out of court. He refused to retract a single word. He wanted the trial. In 1997, the defamation trial commenced in a Los Angeles courtroom. It forced O'Connor to publicly dissect the darkest, most agonizing details of his son's descent into addiction. Perzigian's legal team aggressively cross-examined the elderly actor, attempting to portray Hugh as a troubled adult solely responsible for his own choices, and O'Connor as a vindictive, out-of-control celebrity. But O'Connor remained immovable. He took the witness stand and delivered the most vital, unscripted performance of his life. He wept openly as he detailed his desperate, decades-long battle to save Hugh. He articulated the exact nature of the parasitic relationship between a dealer and an addict. He argued that the moral culpability of supplying lethal narcotics to a sick man equated to pulling the trigger. He did not rely on legal jargon. He used the unyielding cadence of a master storyteller to force the courtroom to confront the physical reality of addiction. Stripping away the sanitized legal abstractions, O'Connor painted a devastating picture of a predator exploiting a vulnerable mind for profit. He weaponized his legendary ability to command an audience, not to generate laughter, but to expose a man who traded human lives for untraceable cash. In that silent, breathless courtroom, he delivered the most profound monologue of his existence, securing a sliver of justice no scriptwriter could have ever penned. The jury listened to the broken father. They did not take long to deliberate. They returned a swift, decisive verdict, completely in favor of Carroll O'Connor. They ruled that his statements, given the circumstances of his son's death and the dealer's actions, did not constitute actionable slander. The legal victory vindicated his public outrage, but O'Connor knew a single court case would not dismantle the system that had killed his son. He channeled his remaining energy and resources into legislative warfare. He became a relentless, formidable lobbyist in the state of California. He utilized his political connections, his wealth, and his tragic moral authority to push for a radical change in the law. His efforts directly resulted in the passage of the Drug Dealer Civil Liability Act in California. This groundbreaking legislation fundamentally altered the legal landscape. It granted the surviving family members of overdose victims the right to sue drug dealers in civil court for financial damages. O'Connor engineered a system that allowed grieving parents to attack the narcotics trade where it hurt most, their financial assets. He had taken his private agony and forged it into a permanent weapon for other families. Carroll O'Connor had defeated the man who sold his son the drugs. He had defeated the slander lawsuit in a highly publicized trial. He had even forced the government to rewrite the law to protect future victims. He had won every battle he initiated following the tragedy. Yet, standing in the aftermath of these monumental victories, the reality of his situation remained utterly unchanged. He had moved mountains, changed legislation, and destroyed his enemy. But when he went home and closed the door, the house was still silent. The laws and the courtroom triumphs were ultimately hollow. They could not reverse time. They could not undo the gunshot. He had fought the entire world and won, but he was still a father who had lost his son. Carroll O'Connor spent his final years carrying a weight that could never be set down. He did not retreat into comfortable retirement. Instead, he quietly funded rehabilitation centers and spoke directly to families trapped in the same addiction nightmare he had endured. But the physical toll of his grief was undeniable. On June 21st, 2001, at the age of 76, his heart finally gave out. His life offers a stark, unforgiving look at the true cost of cultural immortality. Fame and wealth arrived with staggering speed, but they exacted a relentless toll on his freedom, his identity, and his peace of mind. He was a brilliant, highly educated man who conquered the world of television. He defeated powerful network executives in the boardroom. He defeated a ruthless drug dealer in the courtroom. He even forced the government to rewrite its laws. Yet, for all his intelligence and absolute industry power, he lost the war against the shadow of Archie Bunker. More devastatingly, he was entirely powerless to win the only battle that truly mattered to him, the fight to keep his son alive. Sometimes the greatest role an actor can secure also becomes an inescapable prison. Carroll O'Connor single-handedly changed the way an entire nation saw itself. He forced America to confront its own prejudices through the lens of a worn living room armchair. But in the quiet moments after the cameras stopped rolling, stripped of the scripts and the audience applause, he was simply a father, waiting for a phone call that would break his heart. This is the story of the man behind Archie Bunker and the devastating price he paid.